The camera opens on a man's weathered hands performing CPR on cold concrete, the sound of sirens wailing in the distance like a city's cry for help. They say good deeds go unpunished. They're wrong. In a world where strangers step over the dying, where wealth builds walls instead of bridges, one moment of human decency can shatter everything you thought you knew about power, family, and what it means to truly save someone's life. The visual shifts to expensive boardroom tables, hospital corridors filled with the beeping of life support, and a little girl's drawing of three stick figures holding hands. Some rescues happen in 30 seconds on a sidewalk. Others take a lifetime to understand. And sometimes the person you save ends up saving you back in ways that money can't buy, medicine can't heal, and pride can't destroy. Close up on a brass nameplate reading Head of Building Maintenance as rain begins to fall against floor-to-ceiling windows. This is the story of three hearts that learned to beat as one. But first, someone had to stop breathing, fade to black. The harsh fluorescent lights of the construction site cast long shadows across the unfinished office building as James Martinez packed up his tools for the night. His calloused hands moved with the efficiency of a man who had learned to maximize every minute of his day. At 38, Jim's weathered face told the story of 3 years spent juggling two jobs, raising his daughter alone, and carrying the weight of responsibilities that would have crushed a lesser man. "See you tomorrow, Martinez," called out his foreman, Pete Sullivan, as he locked up the tool shed. "Remember, we start at dawn on the north wing." "I'll be here," Jim replied, shouldering his worn canvas bag. He always was. In 3 years of working construction by day and security shifts by night, Jim had never missed a day, never been late, never complained about the bone-deep exhaustion that had become his constant companion. The October wind whipped through downtown Chicago as Jim walked toward the bus stop, his breath visible in the crisp night air. Michigan Avenue was still busy despite the late hour, with well-dressed people emerging from expensive restaurants and stepping into waiting cars. This part of the city felt like another world compared to the South Side neighborhood where he and Sophia lived, a world of marble lobbies and doormen, where his monthly rent wouldn't cover a single dinner at the restaurants he passed. Jim was checking his phone for the bus schedule when he heard a soft thud followed by the distinctive sound of someone in distress. He looked up to see a woman in an expensive coat collapsed on the sidewalk in front of the gleaming Whitmore Steel building, her body convulsing as she clutched her chest. Without hesitation, Jim dropped his bag and ran toward her. Years of working dangerous construction sites had taught him to act first and think later when someone was in trouble. The woman was conscious but gasping, her face pale with the gray pallor Jim had learned to recognize during Linda's illness. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" He knelt beside her, his hands automatically checking for a pulse. Her heartbeat was erratic, weak. "I think you're having a heart attack. I need you to try to stay calm." The woman's eyes, a striking blue-gray that reminded him of winter skies, locked onto his face. She tried to speak but could only manage a whisper. "Tell my sister, in Boston, I'm sorry." Jim's hands moved with practiced efficiency, loosening the woman's collar and positioning her to help her breathing. He'd learned CPR during Linda's cancer treatment, when the doctors had warned him about potential complications. Now those skills kicked in automatically as he began chest compressions, counting under his breath while calling 911 on his phone. "Stay with me," he said firmly as the woman's eyes began to flutter closed. "You're going to be okay. Help is coming." The siren seemed to take forever, though Jim knew it was probably only minutes. As he continued CPR, he found himself talking to the woman, his voice calm and reassuring despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He told her about Sophia, about how his daughter would want him to help, about how every life was precious and worth fighting for. When the paramedics arrived, they worked with the efficiency of professionals who had seen this scenario countless times. As they loaded the woman into the ambulance, she reached out and grabbed Jim's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the medical equipment. "Thank you for stopping." Jim watched the ambulance disappear into the night, its red lights flashing against the glass towers of downtown Chicago. Only then did he realize his hands were shaking. He picked up his bag, checked the time, and hurried toward the bus stop. Sophia would be waiting for him to help with her homework, and Mrs. Chen from next door had already stayed later than planned to watch her. As the bus carried him back to South Side, Jim stared out the window at the city lights and thought about the woman's words. Tell my sister in Boston I'm sorry. Whatever burden she carried, whatever regret haunted her, he hoped she would have the chance to address it herself. He'd done what he could. The rest was up to the doctors and whatever strength she could find within herself. Jim had no way of knowing that the woman he'd saved was Eleanor Whitmore, CEO of one of Chicago's largest steel companies, worth an estimated $2.8 billion. He didn't know that her collapse had been witnessed by the building's security cameras, or that by morning, those cameras would provide enough footage to identify him. All he knew was that someone had needed help, and he'd been in the right place at the right time to provide it. The apartment building where Jim and Sophia lived was a far cry from the gleaming towers of downtown. Built in the 1960s, it showed its age in peeling paint and creaky hallways. But the rent was affordable, and their neighbors looked out for each other. Mrs. Chen was waiting in the small living room when Jim arrived home. Her weathered face creased with concern. Sophia finished her homework and had dinner, she reported in her accented English. But she's been worried about you. You're later than usual. Got held up downtown, Jim said, handing Mrs. Chen the $20 he could barely afford for her babysitting. Everything okay with the math homework? She's getting better with fractions, but still struggles. Maybe tutor would help, but Mrs. Chen trailed off, understanding that tutoring wasn't in Jim's budget. After Mrs. Chen left, Jim found Sophia in her small bedroom, surrounded by textbooks and the marine biology poster that reminded him painfully of Linda's dreams for their daughter. At 10 years old, Sophia Martinez had her mother's dark eyes and gentle spirit, but she'd also inherited a strength that sometimes amazed Jim. Daddy, you look tired, Sophia said, looking up from the book she was reading. Was work hard today? Just a long day, mija, Jim said, settling on the edge of her bed. How was school, Mrs. Chen said you did well with your math. It's getting easier, Sophia said, then hesitated. Daddy, I need to tell you something about my eyes. Jim's heart clenched. Sophia had been born with a mild vision condition that was gradually worsening. The specialist had recommended expensive corrective lenses that their insurance wouldn't cover $3,200 that might as well have been $32,000 given their current financial situation. What about your eyes, sweetheart? They're getting blurrier again. I can't really see the board from my seat in class anymore. I didn't want to worry you, but Jim pulled his daughter close, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness that came with being unable to provide something his child needed. Linda would have known what to do, would have found a way to make it work. She'd always been the optimist, the problem solver, the one who turned obstacles into adventures. We'll figure it out, he said, kissing the top of Sophia's head. I promise. Later that night, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Jim sat at their small kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee and the stack of bills that never seemed to get smaller. The medical debt from Linda's cancer treatment still loomed like a mountain he was climbing $1 at a time. The rent was due in a week. Sophia needed those special glasses. The refrigerator was making that sound again that meant expensive repairs were coming. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through job listings, looking for weekend work that might bring in extra cash, construction, security, moving services, anything that would pay and not interfere with his weekday schedule. The math was always the same, never quite enough, no matter how hard he worked or how many hours he put in. But as he prepared for bed, Jim found himself thinking about the woman he'd helped that evening. He hoped she was okay, hoped she'd survived whatever had struck her down on that cold sidewalk. In a city of millions, he'd probably never know what happened to her. That was fine with him. He hadn't helped her expecting gratitude or reward. Sometimes doing the right thing was its own payment. 3 days after the incident, Jim was working on the scaffolding of the North Wing when Pete called him down. Martinez, There's someone here to see you, his foreman said, gesturing toward a sleek black car parked at the construction site's entrance. Jim climbed down from the scaffolding, wiping his hands on his work shirt. A woman in an expensive business suit was standing beside the car, holding what looked like an envelope. She was probably in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of confident bearing that spoke of corporate boardrooms and six-figure salaries. "Mr. Martinez," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Catherine Walsh. I work for Eleanor Whitmore." The name meant nothing to Jim, but the woman's serious expression suggested it should. "Ma'am, I think you might have the wrong person. You helped a woman having a heart attack on Monday night, outside the Whitmore Steel Building on Michigan Avenue," Catherine continued. "Eleanor Whitmore. She asked me to find you." Understanding dawned on Jim's face. "Is she okay? The lady who collapsed?" "She's recovering, thanks to you," Catherine said, her formal demeanor softening slightly. "Mr. Martinez, you saved her life. Without your immediate intervention, she likely wouldn't have survived until the paramedics arrived." Jim felt a wave of relief wash over him. "I'm glad she's okay. That's all I needed to know." "She'd like to thank you personally," Catherine said, holding out the envelope. "And she wanted me to give you this." Jim accepted the envelope reluctantly, feeling its weight. Through the expensive paper, he could feel what was obviously a check. "Ma'am, I appreciate the thought, but I can't accept this." Catherine's eyebrows rose. "You haven't even looked at it." "Don't need to," Jim said firmly. "I didn't help your boss expecting payment. I helped because someone needed help. That's what decent people do." "Mr. Martinez, you don't understand. This is Eleanor Whitmore." "Lady," Jim interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd made up his mind. "I got a daughter watching how I handle myself in this world. I can't teach her that helping people is about getting paid. Keep your money. I'm just glad your boss is alive." He handed the envelope back to Catherine, who stared at it as if she'd never seen anyone refuse money before. In her world of corporate negotiations and financial incentives, Jim's response was almost incomprehensible. "She's going to want to meet you," Catherine said finally. "She doesn't owe me anything," Jim replied, already turning back toward the scaffolding. "But if she wants to say thanks in person, she knows where to find me." As the black car pulled away from the construction site, Pete walked over to Jim with a bemused expression. "You know who Eleanor Whitmore is, right? Should I? Martinez. She's one of the richest women in Chicago, owns half the steel used in this city's construction. That woman probably just offered you more money than you make in a year." Jim shrugged, picking up his hard hat. "Money you don't earn isn't really yours. Besides, I got everything I need." Pete shook his head in amazement. "You're either the most honest man I've ever met, or the craziest." "Maybe both," Jim said with a slight smile. "Now let's get back to work. These buildings don't build themselves." But even as he climbed back up the scaffolding, Jim found himself thinking about Eleanor Whitmore. What kind of life led someone to collapse alone on a downtown sidewalk at 11 p.m.? What sister in Boston was she sorry to? And why did a billionaire CEO think that money was the appropriate response to basic human decency? That evening, as he helped Sophia with her homework at their small kitchen table, Jim mentioned the visit from Catherine Walsh. He didn't mention the money that wasn't important, but he told Sophia that the woman he'd helped was okay. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," Sophia said, looking up from her math worksheet. "Mama always said helping people was the most important thing we could do." "Your mother was a smart woman," Jim said, thinking about Linda's endless capacity for compassion. Even during her own illness, she'd insisted on volunteering at the children's hospital, reading stories to kids who were facing their own battles with cancer. "Do you think you'll see the lady again?" Sophia asked. "Probably not, mija. Different worlds. You know." But Jim was wrong. Eleanor Whitmore was not a woman who gave up easily, and Jim Martinez had presented her with a puzzle she was determined to solve. In her executive suite overlooking Lake Michigan, Eleanor sat across from her private investigator, reviewing a comprehensive report on the man who had saved her life, and then walked away from what most people would consider a fortune. James Martinez, 38, widowed. Read David Chen. No relation to Jim's neighbor, but equally thorough in his work. Wife Linda died of breast cancer 3 years ago. One daughter, Sophia, age 10. Works construction for Sullivan and Associates. Picks up night security shifts when available. Lives in a 2-bedroom apartment on South Side. Never missed a rent payment despite financial pressures. Eleanor studied the photographs David had provided, surveillance shots that showed Jim walking Sophia to school, shopping for groceries with careful attention to prices, working on construction sites with the focused intensity of a man who couldn't afford to make mistakes. Medical debt from his wife's treatment, she asked. Substantial, about $85,000 remaining. He's been paying it down steadily, never missed a payment, but at his current income level, it'll take him another 8 to 10 years to clear it. Eleanor's chest tightened, though not with the cardiac distress that had nearly killed her. Jim Martinez was living the kind of financial nightmare that would destroy most people. Yet he'd turned down her money without a second thought. More than that, he'd done it on principle, because he wanted to set the right example for his daughter. "Tell me about the child," she said. "Sophia Martinez, 4th grade, honor roll student at Roosevelt Elementary, needs corrective lenses for a degenerative vision condition, specialty glasses that cost about $200. Not covered by their insurance?" Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering her own childhood struggles with vision problems. The way blurry sight had made school a challenge until her father finally scraped together money for glasses. But her father had been able to afford the treatment. Jim Martinez was facing a choice between his daughter's sight and financial ruin. "There's something else," David continued. "I did some digging into the family's medical history. Linda Martinez volunteered extensively at Children's Memorial Hospital during her treatment. The nurses there remember her fondly, said she was one of the most compassionate volunteers they'd ever had." A memory stirred in Eleanor's mind. Children's Memorial Hospital. She'd endowed a wing there 15 years ago, had occasionally visited to see how her donation was being used. She vaguely remembered meeting volunteers, including a young Latina woman with gentle eyes who had been receiving treatment herself while still finding time to help sick children. "Find out more about Linda Martinez's volunteer work," Eleanor said quietly, "and set up a meeting with Jim Martinez. Not at his work site somewhere neutral. Tell him I just want to say thank you properly." "He might refuse again," David warned. "Then we'll have to be more creative in our approach." Eleanor stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, looking down at the city where Jim Martinez was probably finishing another double shift. Probably calculating whether he could afford Sophia's glasses. Probably wondering how he was going to make it all work. Eleanor Whitmore had spent her adult life solving problems through the application of money and influence. James Martinez represented a different kind of challenge, a man whose integrity couldn't be purchased, whose principles were more valuable to him than financial security. It was the most interesting problem she'd encountered in years. The meeting took place on a Saturday morning at Navy Pier, neutral territory where neither Jim's work clothes nor Eleanor's corporate attire would seem out of place. Eleanor arrived early, nervous in a way she hadn't felt since her first board presentation 30 years ago. She'd faced down hostile investors, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, and built a steel empire from her father's modest company. Yet the prospect of talking to Jim Martinez made her hands shake slightly as she sipped her coffee. Jim arrived precisely on time, Sophia's hand in his as they walked along the pier. Eleanor had suggested he bring his daughter, sensing that Sophia might be the key to getting past Jim's defenses. The little girl was beautiful, with her father's serious dark eyes and an air of maturity that spoke of children who'd learned early that life wasn't always fair. "Mr. Martinez," Eleanor said, standing as they approached the bench where she'd been waiting. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Sophia wanted to see the lake," Jim replied, his tone polite but guarded. "And she was curious about the lady her daddy helped." Sophia stepped forward with the directness that only children possessed. "Are you feeling better now? Daddy said you were very sick." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, not cardiac distress, but an emotion she hadn't experienced in years. Much better, thanks to your father. He saved my life. Daddy's good at helping people, Sophia said matter-of-factly. Mama taught him that. She said helping others is how we make the world better. Eleanor looked at Jim, seeing him not as the working-class man who'd refused her money, but as a father who was raising a child with the same values his wife had embodied. Your mother sounds like she was a wonderful woman. She was, Jim said quietly. Sophia, why don't you go look at the boats for a few minutes? Stay where I can see you. As Sophia wandered toward the railing, Eleanor and Jim sat on the bench, the awkwardness of their different worlds hanging between them like fog off the lake. I need to ask you something, Eleanor said finally. Why did you refuse the money it was enough to solve your immediate problems? Maybe even pay for Sophia's glasses? Jim was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter point excitedly at a passing sailboat. How do you know about Sophia's glasses? I had you investigated, Eleanor admitted. I know that sounds invasive, but I needed to understand who you are, why you helped me. And what did you find out? That you're exactly what you appear to be, a good man trying to do right by his daughter, working harder than anyone should have to work, carrying burdens that would crush most people. Eleanor paused, choosing her words carefully. I also found out that your wife volunteered at Children's Memorial Hospital during her cancer treatment. Jim's head turned sharply toward Eleanor, his eyes narrowing. What does Linda have to do with anything? I endowed the pediatric oncology wing at that hospital 15 years ago. I met your wife there. Jim, I remember her. She was getting chemotherapy herself, but she spent her good days reading to children who were scared and alone. The nurses told me she had a gift for making kids feel brave. The color drained from Jim's face as he processed this information. You knew Linda. Not well, but yes, she made an impression on me. That kind of selflessness is rare. Eleanor's voice grew softer. I did some more digging after I remembered her. Did you know that during her final months, someone anonymously covered her experimental treatment costs? The treatments that gave her an extra 6 months with you and Sophia? Jim stared at Eleanor, understanding beginning to dawn. That was you. Linda Martinez was exactly the kind of person that money was meant to help. Someone who gave everything to others, who deserved every chance to fight for more time with her family. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she hadn't shed in years. I never told her it was me. I wanted her to focus on getting better, not on feeling grateful to a stranger. She never knew, Jim whispered. She thought it was some kind of hospital program. Good. That's what I wanted. Eleanor wiped her eyes, struggling to maintain composure. Jim, you saved my life on Monday night, but 3 years ago, I tried to save your wife's life. The circle was already there. I just didn't realize it until now. They sat in silence, watching Sophia collect shells along the water's edge. The revelation had shifted something fundamental between them, creating a connection that transcended their economic differences. The money you offered, Jim said finally, it wasn't about payment, was it? No, it was about completion, about honoring the connection between your family and mine. Eleanor turned to face him fully. Jim, I don't have children. I don't have siblings I speak to. I built an empire, but I never built a life. When you performed CPR on that sidewalk, you didn't just restart my heart, you reminded me that connection, real human connection, is what makes life worth living. Sophia came running back, her hands full of interesting rocks and shells. Daddy, look what I found. Can we take them home? Of course, mija, Jim said, accepting the treasures with the seriousness Sophia's offerings deserved. Ms. Whitmore, Sophia said, suddenly shy. Would you like one of my shells? The pretty blue one looks like your eyes. Eleanor accepted the small blue shell with reverence, as if Sophia had offered her a precious gem. Thank you, Sophia. I'll treasure it. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor made one final attempt. Jim, I understand why you refused the money, but what if I offered you something else? Not payment, but opportunity. A job at Whitmore Steel, head of building maintenance. $75,000 a year plus health insurance that would cover Sophia's glasses. Jim hesitated, and Eleanor could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Pride warring with practical need. Principle competing with his daughter's welfare. "Daddy," Sophia said quietly, "maybe God sent Miss Whitmore to help us help her." Out of the mouths of babes, Jim looked at his daughter, then at Eleanor, then at the lake that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Sometimes the courage to accept help required just as much strength as the determination to refuse it. "I'd need to know it's a real job," he said finally. "Not charity disguised as employment." "It's a real job," Eleanor assured him, "with real responsibilities. I need someone I can trust to oversee the maintenance and safety of our facilities. Someone who cares about doing things right, not just doing them quickly." Jim Martinez had spent 3 years learning that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. As he shook Eleanor Whitmore's hand, agreeing to start work the following Monday, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Linda's death: hope for a future that included possibilities instead of just survival. The Whitmore Steel corporate headquarters was a monument to American industrial success. Its Art Deco facade and marble lobby, speaking of old money and established power. As Jim Martinez walked through the revolving doors on his first morning, he felt like he was entering a foreign country where he didn't speak the language or understand the customs. Eleanor met him in the lobby, looking every inch the successful CEO in her tailored navy suit, but her smile was warm and genuine, the same expression Jim had seen when she'd accepted Sophia's shell at Navy Pier. "Ready for the grand tour?" she asked, leading him toward the elevators. The maintenance department occupied an entire floor of the building, with offices that overlooked Grant Park and equipment that was decades newer than anything Jim had worked with at construction sites. His new workspace was modest but professional: a desk with a computer, a phone, and a nameplate that read James Martinez, head of building maintenance, in crisp black lettering. "This feels surreal," Jim admitted, running his fingers over the brass nameplate. "You'll do fine," Eleanor said. "The previous manager left excellent documentation, and you'll have a team of experienced technicians. Most importantly, you understand that maintaining a building isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about preventing problems before they start." The first few weeks were a whirlwind of learning new systems, meeting department heads, and gradually earning the respect of the maintenance crew. Jim's practical experience and genuine concern for safety made him popular with employees at every level. He remembered names, listened to concerns, and found solutions that balanced efficiency with worker welfare. The transformation wasn't just professional. For the first time in 3 years, Jim could afford to buy Sophia new clothes when she outgrew her old ones. The health insurance meant regular checkups and, most importantly, the corrective lenses Sophia needed. The glasses arrived on a Tuesday, and when Jim picked Sophia up from school that day, her face was radiant with joy. "Daddy, I can see everything," she exclaimed, pointing at details she'd been missing for months. "The leaves on the trees, the words on signs, even your face is sharper." That evening, as Sophia did homework that was no longer a struggle to read, Jim called Eleanor to thank her, but Eleanor had news of her own. "I wanted you to know that I've been in touch with my sister Mary in Boston," she said. "We haven't spoken in 20 years, but your example, watching how you honor Linda's memory while building a new life, it inspired me to try healing old wounds." "What happened between you two?" Jim asked, settling into his favorite chair while Sophia worked at the kitchen table. "The usual family drama. Dad left the company to me instead of her. She thought it was because I was more ruthless, more willing to put business before relationships. She wasn't entirely wrong." Eleanor's voice carried old pain. "Mary became a social worker, dedicated her life to helping families. We chose different paths and somehow decided that meant we couldn't share the same destination. And now I realize that success without family is just expensive loneliness. I'm flying to Boston next weekend to see her." As the months passed, Eleanor became a regular presence in Jim and Sophia's life. She attended Sophia's school plays, helped with science projects, and gradually learned what it meant to be part of a family. For Sophia, Eleanor filled a grandmother-shaped void she hadn't even realized existed. For Jim, Eleanor represented something more complex, a friendship that was slowly deepening into something neither of them had expected. The shift became apparent during Sophia's 10th birthday party, held in their small apartment with decorations from the dollar store and a homemade cake that Sophia had helped bake. Eleanor arrived with a present that made Sophia gasp, a professional-grade telescope that would let her explore the stars she'd always loved. "It's too much," Jim protested quietly as Sophia and her friends from school marveled at the telescope's precision instruments. "It's exactly enough," Eleanor replied. "Jim, when was the last time you saw that child so happy?" As the party wound down and the other children went home, Sophia hugged Eleanor tightly. "Thank you for the telescope, and thank you for making Daddy smile again." That night, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Jim and Eleanor sat on the small balcony of his apartment, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about their lives in a way that transcended their employer-employee relationship. "I never thought I'd find this," Eleanor admitted, gesturing toward the warm glow of their small home. "Family, belonging, the feeling that someone would miss me if I disappeared. You've built an empire. Eleanor, you've got hundreds of employees, board members. Who would replace me within a week and never think of me again?" Eleanor interrupted. "What you and Sophia have given me this sense of being needed, not for what I can provide, but for who I am. I'd trade everything I own for that feeling." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Jim found himself studying Eleanor's face in the soft light from the apartment, seeing not the powerful CEO but the woman who'd learned to love his daughter, who'd helped him build a future, who'd become essential to his understanding of what family could be. "Eleanor," he began, but she held up her hand. "I know this is complicated," she said softly. "I know our worlds are different, our ages, our experiences. But Jim, somewhere along the way, gratitude became friendship, and friendship became something deeper. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just needed you to know that you and Sophia have become the most important things in my life." Jim was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Linda, about the promises he'd made to her, about the man he'd become since her death. Linda had always wanted him to find love again, had made him promise not to spend his life as a monument to her memory. "What would Sophia think?" he asked finally. "Why don't you ask her?" The next morning, as Jim prepared breakfast, Sophia emerged from her bedroom with the serious expression she wore when processing important information. "Daddy, I need to talk to you about Ms. Eleanor." Jim's heart skipped. Had his daughter overheard their conversation? "What about her, Mija? I think you should marry her." Jim nearly dropped the spatula he was holding. "Sophia, she loves us, Daddy, and you love her too, even if you're scared to say it." Sophia climbed onto her chair at the kitchen table with the authority of someone who'd made up her mind. "Mama told me before she went to heaven that love doesn't get used up when you share it. It just gets bigger." You remember Mama saying that. I remember lots of things Mama said, and I think she'd like Ms. Eleanor. They both help people, and they both make you happy." Sophia paused, studying her father's face. "Are you worried that loving Ms. Eleanor means you love Mama less? The wisdom of children could be devastating in its simplicity." Jim sat across from his daughter, marveling at her ability to cut through adult complications, to reach the heart of what mattered. "Maybe a little," he admitted. "That's silly," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "I love you, and I love Mama, and I love Ms. Eleanor. My heart isn't smaller because there are more people in it." That afternoon, Jim called Eleanor and asked if she'd like to have dinner with them, not as Sophia's benefactor or his employer, but as family. Eleanor's acceptance was immediate and joyful, and when she arrived that evening with flowers for Sophia and wine for Jim, the apartment felt complete in a way it hadn't since Linda's death. After dinner, as Sophia worked on homework and Eleanor helped wash dishes, they moved with the comfortable rhythm of people who belong together. When Sophia finished her schoolwork, She curled up between Jim and Eleanor on the couch for their nightly reading time, and Eleanor's arm around both of them felt as natural as breathing. "I love you," Eleanor whispered to Jim as Sophia dozed against his shoulder. "I love you too," he replied, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable. They were building something neither of them had planned, but both of them needed a family forged from loss and hope, held together by love that honored the past while embracing the future. But their happiness was about to face its greatest test. 4 months into their deepening relationship, Eleanor was in the middle of a tense board meeting when the familiar crushing pain struck her chest like a lightning bolt. This time, however, she wasn't alone on a dark sidewalk. She was surrounded by the most powerful people in Chicago business, and every second of her medical crisis was witnessed by men and women who controlled billions in assets. The mahogany conference table became a blur as Eleanor felt her body betray her again, the same terrifying sensation of her heart failing to do its most basic job. But even as consciousness began to slip away, she heard a familiar voice cutting through the chaos. "Call 911. Jim's voice was calm and authoritative as he burst through the conference room doors. He'd been in the building reviewing HVAC upgrades when someone had run to find him. "Ms. Whitmore, I need you to stay with me." His hands found their familiar position on her chest, beginning the compressions that had saved her life once before. Around them, board members scrambled for phones and cleared space. But Jim's focus was entirely on Eleanor, his voice steady and reassuring as he worked to keep her alive. "Not again," Eleanor whispered as her eyes fluttered open. "Yes, again," Jim said firmly, his hands never stopping their rhythm. "But we know what to do now. You're going to be okay." Dr. Patricia Williams, the cardiologist who had treated Eleanor after her first heart attack, was waiting in the emergency department when the ambulance arrived. After Eleanor was stabilized and moved to the cardiac ICU, Dr. Williams requested a meeting with Jim in the hospital corridor. "Mr. Martinez, I need you to understand something about Eleanor's condition," she said, her expression grave. "This second episode tells us that her coronary artery disease is progressive. The medications and lifestyle changes we implemented after her first heart attack haven't been sufficient." Jim felt the familiar weight of medical dread settle on his shoulders. He'd stood in too many hospital corridors, had too many conversations that began with doctors explaining why the treatments weren't working. "What are you saying exactly?" "She needs surgery, triple bypass to create new pathways around the blocked arteries. Without it, she's at extremely high risk for another cardiac event, and next time we might not be able to save her." "What are the risks of the surgery, doctor?" Williams handed him a thick folder of medical literature and consent forms. "Every major surgery carries risks: infection, bleeding, stroke, complications from anesthesia. But Eleanor's relatively young for this type of procedure, and her overall health is good apart from the cardiac issues. The bigger risk is doing nothing." That evening, as Eleanor recovered from the immediate crisis, Jim sat beside her hospital bed while Sophia did homework in the corner chair that had become her regular spot during their visits. Eleanor was awake but groggy from medications, her face pale against the white hospital linens. "How bad is it this time?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Dr. Williams says you need surgery," Jim said gently. "Bypass surgery to fix the blocked arteries." Eleanor closed her eyes, and Jim could see her processing this information with the same analytical approach she brought to business challenges. But unlike corporate problems, this couldn't be solved through negotiation or strategic planning. "I'm scared, Jim," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been this scared in my life." "I know," he said, taking her hand. "But you're not facing this alone. Sophia and we're going to be right here through all of it." Sophia looked up from her homework with the seriousness that had characterized her since her mother's illness. "Ms. Eleanor, when Mama was sick, Daddy told me that being scared was okay as long as you're brave too. And you're the bravest person I know except for him." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, not tears of fear, though the fear was certainly there, but tears of gratitude for this family that had chosen to love her completely, medical crises and all. But not everyone in Eleanor's world viewed her relationship with Jim and Sophia with such acceptance. 3 days before the scheduled surgery, Eleanor received an urgent request for a meeting with the board of directors. She knew it wasn't about business when she saw the grim expressions around the conference table, the same room where Jim had saved her life for the second time. "Eleanor, we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised," said Harrison Mills, the board's longest-serving member and Eleanor's father's old business partner. "Concerns about your relationship with James Martinez and whether it's affecting your judgment?" Eleanor felt her blood pressure spike, though whether from anger or cardiac stress, she couldn't tell. "Explain." "There are questions about his motivations," said board member Catherine Reed, a woman Eleanor had mentored for years. "About whether he's taking advantage of your gratitude and current vulnerability. You're suggesting that a man who has twice saved my life, who has proven himself professionally for months, who is supporting me through a health crisis, is somehow manipulating me. We're suggesting that the optics are problematic," Harrison continued. "A working-class employee entering into a personal relationship with the CEO he rescued. It raises questions about what?" Eleanor's voice carried the steel that had built her empire. "About whether a man's worth is determined by his bank account or his character, about whether genuine love is less valuable than inherited wealth." The room fell silent. Eleanor had never spoken about love before, had never acknowledged that her relationship with Jim was anything more than friendship and gratitude. "Eleanor," Catherine said carefully, "we're not questioning Mr. Martinez's character, but surely you can see how this appears to others, how it appears to to people who think that economic status determines human value." Eleanor stood, her anger giving her strength despite her physical frailness. "James Martinez has shown more integrity in the months I've known him than some people demonstrate in entire careers. He refused my money, earned his position through merit, and is now choosing to stand by me through surgery that could leave me disabled or dead. If you can't see the quality of that man's character, then you're not as smart as I thought you were." After the board members left, Eleanor called Jim to warn him about the questions he might face. She found him in the hospital cafeteria, where he was having lunch with Sophia before her afternoon visit to Eleanor's room. "Let them question," Jim said simply after Eleanor explained the board's concerns. "I know why I'm here, and so do you. If they think I'm after your money, they obviously don't understand that the best thing you've given me isn't financial, it's the chance to be part of something bigger than just surviving day to day." Sophia looked up from her coloring book, her expression serious. "Why are people being mean about Daddy? Because sometimes," Eleanor explained, "when people don't understand something, they assume the worst instead of trying to see the good." "That's silly," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "Anyone can see that Daddy loves you because you're family now, not because you're rich." The night before surgery, Eleanor lay in her hospital bed trying to calm her racing thoughts. In the morning, she would be unconscious on an operating table while surgeons worked to repair the damage that years of stress and isolation had inflicted on her heart. The statistical success rate was good, but statistics meant nothing when you were the one facing the scalpel. Jim sat in the chair beside her bed, holding her hand while Sophia slept curled up in the reclining chair the nursing staff had provided. They talked quietly about practical matters: Sophia's school schedule, work projects that would need attention, the post-surgical care plan Dr. Williams had outlined. "Jim," Eleanor said finally, "I need to tell you something. If something goes wrong tomorrow, nothing's going wrong tomorrow. But if it does, I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my adult life. You and Sophia have given me something I never knew I was missing: a real family." Jim was quiet for a moment, studying Eleanor's face in the soft light from the bedside lamp. "Eleanor, I need you to know something too. What's happening between us, it's not just gratitude or convenience. Somewhere along the way, you became essential to Sophia and me, not because of what you can provide, but because of who you are." "What are you saying?" Jim looked at his sleeping daughter, then back at Eleanor. "I'm saying that if you'll have us, Sophia and I want to be your family. Not just during the good times, but through whatever comes next. Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for the bedside drawer. Inside was a small velvet box that she'd been carrying since the day she'd learned about the surgery. "I want you to have this," she said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band. Jim's breath caught. It was Linda's wedding ring, the one he'd worn on a chain around his neck until recently. The one he'd been forced to sell to a pawn shop to pay for Sophia's school supplies 2 years ago. "I can't take this," he said immediately. "This belongs to you, to Sophia." "I bought it back from the pawn shop," Eleanor said quietly. "I wanted you to have it again, to keep it safe. If something happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I understand what Linda meant to you, what she still means. I'm not trying to replace that or compete with it. I just want you to know that I'm grateful to be part of the love that continues because of who she helped you become." Jim stared at the ring, his throat tight with emotion. "Eleanor, keep it safe for both of us," she whispered. "And when I wake up tomorrow, we can talk about what forever looks like for our strange little family." As dawn approached, Jim dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable hospital chair while Eleanor stared at the ceiling, trying to calm her racing thoughts. In a few hours, she would face the greatest challenge of her life, not a business negotiation or corporate crisis, but a battle for the simple right to continue existing, to continue loving and being loved by the family that had chosen her. The ring box sat on her bedside table, a symbol not of endings, but of new beginnings, of love that transcended loss, and of the possibility that sometimes the most profound healing happened not in operating rooms, but in the quiet moments when people chose to care for each other, without reservation or expectation of return. The surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m., but Jim and Sophia had been awake since 5, sitting in the preoperative waiting area while Eleanor underwent final preparations. The hospital waiting room was filled with uncomfortable plastic chairs and the quiet desperation of families facing medical uncertainty. Sophia sat beside her father, working in the same coloring book she'd brought to every hospital visit, carefully adding details to a garden scene she'd explained would make Eleanor think of spring when she woke up. Her small fingers gripped the crayons with the focused intensity of a child who understood that some situations required her very best effort. "Daddy, your face is doing the worried thing again," Sophia said quietly, looking up from her artwork. "I know, mija. I'm just thinking about Eleanor. She's going to be okay," Sophia said with the confidence that children sometimes possessed about things adults found uncertain. "The doctors are really smart, and Eleanor is strong. Plus, she promised she'd help me with my science project when she gets better." At 7:15, Dr. Williams appeared in surgical scrubs to update them on the preoperative preparations. "Eleanor is in excellent spirits," she reported. "The anesthesia team is with her now, and we should be starting the procedure within the next 30 minutes. "How long will it take?" Jim asked, though he'd been told the answer several times. 4 to 6 hours, depending on what we find when we get in there. The good news is that her overall health is excellent apart from the cardiac issues. That's a significant advantage." After Dr. Williams left, Jim found himself remembering the night Sophia had been born, the endless hours of waiting while Linda fought to bring their daughter safely into the world. That had been waiting filled with anticipation and joy. This was different, waiting filled with the terrible possibility of loss. Around 10 a.m., Sophia announced she was hungry, so Jim walked with her to the hospital cafeteria. The familiar smells of institutional coffee and prepackaged sandwiches reminded him of the countless meals he'd eaten in similar places during Linda's treatment. But Sophia's chatter about her coloring book and plans for Eleanor's recovery kept him anchored in hope rather than fear. "When Eleanor comes home," Sophia said between bites of her grilled cheese sandwich, "can we make her soup? You always said soup was good for sick people." "That's a wonderful idea," Jim said, marveling at his daughter's capacity for nurturing. At 10 years old, she'd already learned that healing required more than medical intervention. It needed love, attention, and small gestures that reminded people they weren't alone. When they returned to the waiting room, Dr. Williams was nowhere to be seen, which Jim took as a good sign. No news was better than urgent news, better than the grim-faced conversations that meant complications and uncertain outcomes. At 1:47 in the afternoon, Dr. Williams emerged from the surgical suite, still wearing her scrubs, but with an expression that was calm rather than urgent. Jim felt his heart skip as he stood up, Sophia's hand immediately finding his as they approached the surgeon together. "The surgery went very well, Doctor," Williams said without preamble. Understanding that anxious families needed good news delivered quickly and clearly, "We were able to complete all 3 bypass grafts successfully. Eleanor's heart responded beautifully to the procedure, and her vital signs have been stable throughout." Jim felt his knees weaken with relief, and he had to sit back down on the edge of the plastic chair that had become his anchor through the longest day he'd experienced since Linda's death. Sophia, however, bounced on her toes with excitement. "Can we see her? Is she awake?" Sophia asked, her 10-year-old directness cutting through adult reserve. "She's in recovery now, and she'll be sedated for several more hours," Dr. Williams explained, crouching down to Sophia's level. "But in about an hour, you can see her briefly. She won't be able to talk much because of the breathing tube, but she'll be able to hear you." When they were finally allowed into the cardiac ICU, Jim wasn't prepared for how small Eleanor looked surrounded by machines and monitors. Tubes and wires connected her to devices that tracked every heartbeat, every breath, every vital sign that proved the surgery had given her what she'd needed: a chance to continue living. Sophia approached the bed with the reverence children show when they encounter something they don't fully understand but recognize as important. In her hands was the get well card she'd finished that morning, a hand-drawn picture of 3 stick figures standing under a rainbow, with Jim, Sophia, and Eleanor carefully labeled in 10-year-old handwriting. "Can she hear us?" Sophia whispered to the ICU nurse, who nodded with a smile. "Eleanor," Sophia said softly, placing her card on the bedside table where Eleanor would see it when she woke up. "We waited for you all day. Daddy was worried, but I told him you were too stubborn to let your heart stay broken." Jim nearly laughed despite the gravity of the moment. Trust Sophia to find exactly the right words, words that honored Eleanor's strength while acknowledging her vulnerability. Over the next hour, Eleanor began to stir as the anesthesia gradually wore off. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly finding Jim's face beside her bed. When she tried to speak, he gently touched her hand. "Don't try to talk yet," he said quietly. "You've got a breathing tube. The surgery went perfectly. Dr. Williams said your heart responded beautifully." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, whether from relief, medication, or emotion. Jim couldn't tell, but when she squeezed his hand weakly, he understood that she was trying to communicate something important. "Sophia's here too," he said, gesturing for his daughter to move closer to the bed. Sophia held up her card so Eleanor could see it. "I drew us as a family," she explained, "because that's what we are now. Right? A family that takes care of each other when someone is sick." Eleanor nodded slightly, her eyes moving between Jim and Sophia with an expression that conveyed everything she couldn't say aloud. In that sterile ICU room, surrounded by the sounds of medical equipment and the quiet efficiency of hospital staff, something fundamental had been confirmed. The crisis had passed, but more than that, the uncertainty about their future together had been resolved. When visiting hours ended and they had to leave, Sophia kissed Eleanor's forehead gently. "Get better fast," she said. "I have so many things to show you when you come home." That evening, Jim and Sophia returned to their apartment for the first time in nearly 24 hours. The place felt different somehow, not just because they were exhausted from the day's emotional marathon, but because they were returning as people who had faced the possibility of loss and emerged with a deeper understanding of what they meant to each other. "Daddy," Sophia said as Jim tucked her into bed, "when Eleanor gets better, are you going to marry her?" The question caught him off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Children often saw things more clearly than adults, cutting through complexity to reach the heart of what mattered. "Would you like that?" he asked carefully. "I think Mama would like it," Sophia said thoughtfully. She always said love doesn't get used up when you share it, it just gets bigger. And Eleanor needs a family as much as we do. As Jim sat in their living room later that night, holding Sophia's handmade card that proclaimed them a family, he realized that his 10-year-old daughter had articulated something he'd been struggling to understand. Love wasn't about replacing what had been lost. It was about having the courage to build something new while honoring what came before. Eleanor was going to recover. They were going to have a future together, and somewhere. Jim believed. Linda was smiling at the family her husband and daughter had chosen to create. 6 months later, on a perfect Saturday morning in May, Jim Martinez stood in the bedroom of the house he now shared with Eleanor and Sophia, adjusting his tie in the mirror while trying to calm the nervous excitement that felt remarkably similar to what he'd experienced on his wedding day with Linda nearly 15 years ago. Today was different, but the emotion was the same. The profound gratitude of a man who had found love twice in one lifetime, who had learned that the heart's capacity for caring was limitless when nurtured by the right people. "Daddy, you look handsome," Sophia said from the doorway, resplendent in her pale blue flower girl dress. Her hair was styled in gentle curls, and she carried herself with the poise of an 11-year-old who understood she was playing an important role in creating something beautiful. "Thank you, Mija. You look pretty gorgeous yourself." The wedding was small and intimate, held in the garden of Eleanor and Jim's new home, a modest house in Lincoln Park that struck the perfect balance between Eleanor's means and Jim's values. The guest list included Sophia's classmates and teachers, Jim's friends from both the construction site and Whitmore Steel, Eleanor's closest business associates, and the neighbors who had become extended family over the past months. Dr. Williams was there, beaming with professional satisfaction at seeing her patient not just survived, but thriving. Mrs. Chen from Jim's old apartment building had been invited as an honored guest, representing the community that had helped raise Sophia during the hardest years. And in the front row sat Mary Whitmore, Eleanor's sister from Boston, whose presence represented one of the most significant healings in Eleanor's life. The reunion with Mary had been Eleanor's first priority after her recovery from surgery. 20 years of silence had been broken by a phone call that began with Eleanor saying, "Mary, I nearly died, and all I could think about was how sorry I was that we let pride keep us apart." The reconciliation had been gradual but genuine, built on shared memories and the understanding that family connections were too precious to sacrifice to old grievances. As the string quartet began playing, Jim took his place beside the minister under an archway of white roses and baby's breath. His hands were steady now, no longer trembling with the nervous energy that had consumed him that morning. This felt right in a way that transcended logic, the natural progression of a relationship built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of love that had grown slowly and sustainably. Sophia walked down the aisle first, scattering rose petals with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred duty. Her smile was radiant, and when she reached the front, she gave Jim a small thumbs up that made several guests chuckle softly. Then Eleanor appeared, and Jim felt his breath catch. She wasn't wearing a traditional white gown, but rather an elegant champagne-colored dress that complemented her silver hair and brought out the color in her eyes. More than her beauty, though, it was the expression on her face that moved him, pure joy, mixed with a peace he'd never seen in her during their months of friendship and courtship. Eleanor had chosen to walk herself down the aisle, a decision that reflected her independence while also honoring the journey that had brought her to this moment. But halfway down the path, she stopped and extended her hand to Sophia, who joined her for the rest of the walk. Together, they approached Jim, the woman who had learned to love again, and the child who had taught them both what family really meant. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with vows they had written themselves. Eleanor spoke about finding salvation not just in Jim's CPR that night on the sidewalk, but in his daily example of how to live with integrity, compassion, and courage. Jim talked about how Eleanor had given him and Sophia not just opportunities, but hope, the belief that their best days were still ahead of them. When they exchanged rings, Jim placed Linda's wedding band on Eleanor's right hand, while she placed a new band on his left, honoring the past while embracing the future. Sophia had helped choose Eleanor's engagement ring, a simple solitaire that reflected Eleanor's new appreciation for understated elegance over ostentatious display. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced. And when Jim and Eleanor kissed, Sophia cheered loud enough to make everyone laugh, including the newlyweds. The reception was held in their backyard, with tables arranged under string lights and paper lanterns that Sophia had helped hang. Richard Chen, Eleanor's COO, gave a toast about how Jim had brought humanity to Whitmore Steel's corporate culture, while Pete Sullivan from the construction site spoke about how Jim had never forgotten where he came from, even as his circumstances improved. But the most memorable moment came when Sophia stood on a chair to make her own toast, raising a glass of sparkling apple cider with the seriousness that had characterized her since her mother's illness. "To my new mom, Eleanor, and my dad, Jim," she said, her voice carrying across the garden. "Thank you for showing me that families can grow bigger when people choose to love each other. And to my first mom in heaven, thank you for teaching Daddy how to save people's lives and how to love people's hearts." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as Sophia finished her toast. The wisdom and grace of this child who had lost her mother but gained a family, who had learned that love multiplied rather than divided, left everyone present with a deeper understanding of what really mattered in life. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Jim found himself standing in their kitchen washing dishes while Eleanor dried them, a domestic routine that felt remarkably normal considering how extraordinary their journey had been. The new family portrait they had taken the week before sat on the counter, showing the three of them in their garden, Sophia between her parents with a smile that could power the city. "No regrets?" Eleanor asked, hanging up the dish towel and turning to face him. "Only one," Jim said, pulling her into his arms. "I wish Linda could have met you. I think you two would have been great friends." "I think so too," Eleanor said softly. "But Jim, she did meet me, in a way. Every kind thing you do, every moment you show Sophia how to be compassionate, every time you see the best in people, that's Linda's influence in the world. She's part of what made you the man who saved my life." Later that night, after Sophia had fallen asleep in her new bedroom, decorated with both her marine biology posters and the new telescope Eleanor had given her for her birthday, Jim and Eleanor sat on their front porch, looking up at the stars Sophia loved to count. "What do you think happens next?" Eleanor asked, her head resting on Jim's shoulder. "Whatever it is," Jim said, "we face it together, all three of us." In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the city cars passing, neighbors talking, life continuing in all its ordinary magnificence. But here on their porch, surrounded by the evidence of love chosen and families created through courage and compassion, everything felt exactly as it should be. The story that had begun with a stranger's heart attack on a busy Chicago sidewalk had become something neither of them could have imagined, proof that sometimes the most profound changes in life come not from grand gestures or dramatic events, but from simple human kindness and the willingness to help when help is needed most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new ways to care for each other and their community. Eleanor would continue running Whitmore Steel, but with a renewed understanding of what success really meant. Jim would continue maintaining the buildings that housed people's dreams, but with the security of knowing his own dreams had found solid ground. Sophia would continue growing into the remarkable young woman her parents, all three of them, were helping her become. But tonight, James Martinez held his wife close, listened to his daughter's peaceful breathing through her open window, and felt grateful for the unexpected grace that had transformed them all from survivors into a thriving family built on love, second chances, and the enduring power of one person choosing to help another. The brass nameplate on Jim's desk at Whitmore Steel still read, "James Martinez, Head of Building Maintenance," but it represented so much more than a job title. It symbolized the moment when a struggling single father had accepted that sometimes the courage to receive help required just as much strength as the determination to give it. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him and Sophia, But for Eleanor too, a chapter where success was measured not in quarterly profits, but in moments of shared laughter, family dinners, and the simple peace that came from being truly known and loved. In the end, Eleanor's collapse on that downtown sidewalk had been more than a medical emergency. It had been the moment when three lives converged to create something beautiful, lasting, and infinitely more valuable than all the steel and concrete that surrounded them in their bustling city. Love, as Sophia had wisely observed, didn't get used up when shared. It just got bigger, stronger, and more capable of healing hearts that had forgotten how to hope. And in the quiet moments before sleep, as Eleanor listened to the gentle breathing of her husband and daughter in the rooms nearby, she understood that the real miracle hadn't been Jim's CPR saving her physical heart. The real miracle had been the way this family had saved her soul, teaching her that the greatest fortune wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the number of people who would miss you if you were gone, who would celebrate your victories and comfort your sorrows, who would choose to love you not for what you could provide, but for who you chose to be. The circle was complete. The debt of gratitude had been transformed into something far more precious, a family bound not by obligation, but by choice, not by convenience, but by covenant, proving once again that the most extraordinary stories often begin with the most ordinary acts of human decency and the simple decision to help a stranger in need. The camera slowly pulls back from the family portrait on the kitchen counter, showing Jim, Eleanor, and Sophia laughing together in their garden, then fades to the hospital room where it all began. In the end, James Martinez saved more than Eleanor Whitmore's life that October night. He saved her soul, and she saved his future. Visual montage: Sophia's first pair of glasses, Eleanor's surgery recovery, the wedding ceremony, Linda's grave with fresh flowers. What started as 30 seconds of CPR became a lifetime of second chances. A struggling father found security. A lonely billionaire discovered family. A little girl who'd lost her mother gained something she never expected: proof that love multiplies when you're brave enough to share it. The camera settles on the brass nameplate one final time, then shifts to the Chicago skyline at sunset. Sometimes salvation doesn't come from above. Sometimes it comes from the stranger walking past who decides to stop. From the person who chooses compassion over convenience, connection over comfort. Soft fade to Eleanor's hospital bracelet lying beside Linda's wedding ring. Jim Martinez went to work that day planning to build buildings. Instead, he built a family. Eleanor Whitmore thought success meant standing alone at the top. She learned it meant having people who'd catch you when you fall. What would you have done if you'd been walking past that night fade to black?